America's war on terror has been going on for 10 years now. There seems to be no end in sight. Some experts think terrorists are actually winning that war. I'm joined by counterterrorism expert David Gartenstein-Ross, the man who wrote a book titled Bin Laden's Legacy, Why We're Still Losing the War on Terror. Why, Mr. Gartenstein? I mean, your whole book is about it. Just give us some key points about why you think the U.S. is losing the war on terror.
I think the main thing to look at is the U.S.'s capacity to stop terrorist attacks, as well as its resilience in the face of an attack, compared with the enemy's ability to strike. The problem isn't that al-Qaeda has become more potent. It's not clear that al-Qaeda has been significantly weakened, but it's not clear that it's become more potent. The problem is that the United States has been significantly eroded over the course of the past decade. The economy is, of course, in shambles, with a massive national debt. Now, not all of that is by any means attributable to the fight against al-Qaeda, but more of it is than a lot of people realize, including the massive cost of the Iraq War, the way that the instability that was spurred by that helped to drive up oil prices, helped to drive up the national debt, as well as direct budgetary outlays, and then the opportunity costs, the inability after the economy crashed in 2008 to deliver another stimulus package because a lot of this money had already been spent. When you look at all of that, and when you look at al-Qaeda's goal of economically undermining the United States, I think the conclusion is not that they've destroyed America, but that they've been more effective in undermining their enemy's economy than a lot of people would like to believe.
Well, you're saying the terrorists have defined their strategy as bleeding the United States to bankruptcy, and they have succeeded in many ways. Let's talk money a little bit more. Why do you think the decade-long fight against terror has been such a blow for the Americans?
I think that when one looks at the return on the investment, it's not a great return on investment. A lot of the counterterrorism apparatus and policies have been misdirected, not totally. I mean, I think that doing nothing is also not an option. But the key error was the war in Iraq, which ended up diverting resources away from Afghanistan, costing an enormous amount of money, as well as hurting the U.S.'s standing in the world. Beyond that, the counterterrorism apparatus that had been erected is a very inefficient one. There's so many different secret programs and so many different cooks in the kitchen that it's difficult to have any one individual who can determine that there's not duplicative effort. This also means that not only our offense, things like the Iraq War, but also our defenses are expensive. Now, I think this is something that can be fixed, which is exactly what this is a clarion call for, that we need to understand the situation that we're in and move beyond it.
You know, as you speak, what comes to mind is the Soviet Union. The war in Afghanistan has drained it so badly back in the 80s that, you know, it very much contributed to its collapse. Any lessons to be learned?
Well, this is a lesson that bin Laden had pointed to on multiple occasions. Osama bin Laden had been part of the anti-Soviet resistance originally as a humanitarian worker in Pakistan, and then he eventually went to the battlefield and got so caught up by that he ended up leading a team of Arabs who fought against the Soviets inside of Afghanistan. Now, they were pretty incidental to the fight. There were far more Afghans than there were Arabs at any given point inside of Afghanistan fighting the Soviets. But to bin Laden, this was kind of the paradigmatic fight of how you beat a superpower, by draining them. Now, bin Laden thought that the Afghan-Soviet war brought down the Soviet Union. I think it's not entirely clear historically that it did, especially
contributed.
Yeah, I'm saying it's not entirely clear what kind of impact it has. Historians have mixed views on this, given that by 1986 the Afghan-Soviet war cost about $3 billion, whereas when one looks at the loss of oil export money as well as grain shortages within the Soviet Union, the annual price tag on those far dwarfed the Afghan-Soviet war. But if the Afghan-Soviet war was a significant contributor, it was precisely by grinding it down in that one theater and thus making it unable for the Soviet Union to adapt to other crises that it faced. So I think there are definitely lessons. I mean, there's a lesson in the first instance because this is precisely how bin Laden viewed his fight against the United States, which means that when your enemy is so intent on grinding down your economy, one thing you have to do is make sure that you don't fall into that trap. And a second lesson is that even if an expenditure isn't a massive part of your budget, it can have an impact. And as I said, the impact of the Afghan-Soviet War I find to be historically, I find there to be a historical question mark. But what is indisputable is it certainly didn't help the Soviet Union. And the amount of money that the U.S. has spent overall on the war on terror, even when adjusted for inflation, is much more in terms of sheer quantity than the Soviet Union spent in Afghanistan.
Okay, let's take America's other wars, the ones that had nothing to do with 9/11. Of course, I'm talking about Iraq, first of all. Why spend so much money there? Is it because the U.S. is so rich that it just doesn't know how else to spend the money? Or does the U.S. expect that the wars will eventually pay off?
I don't think there's an expectation that there'd be a monetary gain from the wars. I don't think that these were wars of avarice. Rather, I think that the U.S. quite simply underestimated what was going to happen. When one looks at the lead up to the Iraq War, and bearing in mind that there could have been political spin to try to make it more saleable to the public. But when one looks at the lead up, the estimates given for how much it would cost were rather low-end estimates. You even had officials talking about how the reconstruction of Iraq could pay for itself, in that Iraq could sell oil on the market and they could thus finance their own reconstruction. So I think that people just didn't foresee what ended up happening in terms of this massive insurgency taking hold. It's the law of unintended consequences that particularly when you have an enemy in a certain area, you have to be wary that whatever action you end up taking in another theater, especially one that could end up attracting jihadis, which was known in advance, that could end up snowballing and end up backfiring against you. And that's what happened in Iraq.
Okay, let's take Libya, another campaign unrelated to terrorism. Does Libya in any way contribute to draining the U.S. economically, or is it just the war on terror that does all the draining?
I believe that Libya does, quite obviously, and I think actually it's much, in my view, as someone who had opposed the Libya intervention from the outset, I think it's actually much worse, because in fighting against terrorism, at least you're fighting against people who are trying to destroy your country and to kill American citizens. Whereas in Libya, it was entirely based on a humanitarian intervention. Now, there are different views of liberal humanitarian intervention, but I think that given the economic context that we have in an era of severe austerity, we need to be very hesitant about undertaking such an operation, particularly given, as I said before, the law of unintended consequences. When one looks at the situation in Libya prior to the beginning of the NATO campaign, in my view, there was almost no strategic interest at play, because Muammar Gaddafi was not supporting terrorist groups. Muammar Gaddafi was not, he'd given up his weapons of mass destruction program. This doesn't mean that I'm, sad to see him go. He was a terrible ruler, he was a brutal dictator, and he certainly would have killed a lot of people. He probably would have killed far more people had NATO not started bombing the country. But to me, one of the sad realities of the 21st century is that there will be humanitarian crises that the international community is powerless to do anything about. And in 6 months or a year, we'll have a much better idea of how, from a strategic interest perspective, the intervention in Libya has gone. You have already concerns that some jihadis may have gotten their hands on surface-to-air missiles as part of Gaddafi's arsenal. You have certainly concerns about violent Islamists being able to leave prison during the chaos, and there's the possibility that Gaddafi loyalists will be able to mount an insurgency, all of which, a year from now can make what's going on look a lot worse in retrospect. I hope that doesn't happen, but I certainly am concerned, and our recent history doesn't really bear out that we're very good at cleaning things up. Toppling a regime, the lesson is quite clear, is always the easy part.
Back to the fight against extremists. In your book, you suggest ways to build resilience among Americans to, face future possible attacks, but without overreacting. Can you expand a little bit on that? What ways are you suggesting?
Well, resilience is particularly important when it serves multiple purposes, not just defending against terrorism, but we just have been beset by multiple natural disasters, including a hurricane, an earthquake, and the like. One thing I put forward that would help to build resilience is basically incorporating individual citizens into how community or a state would react to a terrorist attack or to a natural disaster. There's a community emergency response team model in Phoenix, Arizona that I think is particularly good in this regard. This is something that helps citizens to be less afraid and also to feel like if something goes wrong, they can play a role. I think it's important to build not just resilience in terms of infrastructure, but also psychological resilience, so that we're not sitting here afraid of what happens, but we understand that if something bad happens, we can play a role in fixing it and in terms of helping fellow citizens. I think that
without going to war, without waging wars in other countries?
Well, look, first of all, war is sometimes necessary, often not. I think that, for example, in Afghanistan, the United States had to dislodge the Taliban regime that was supporting al-Qaeda and giving them sanctuary. The Iraq War, obviously, I don't agree with, nor the war in Libya. So resilience is not something that becomes the end-all and be-all. But I think it's an important part of what we do in the 21st century, because there's no guarantee that terrorism can never strike.
Thank you.
Thank you.